When the Civil War ended in the spring of 1865, the United States faced a challenge in some ways as great as the war itself. How could the government restore the Southern states to the Union? The Union had survived, the Confederacy had been defeated, and the institution of slavery, which had shaped America's politics, economy, and culture for more than 2 centuries, was abolished. But victory left many unanswered questions. Could a fractured nation be put back together? And how would the nation be different now that the war was over? What would freedom mean for the 4 million African Americans who had lived their entire lives as slaves? That period, known as Reconstruction, lasted from 1865 to 1877. It was one of the most difficult and complicated chapters in American history, an era when the nation attempted to redefine itself, confronting not only the damage of war, but the very meaning of citizenship, freedom, and equality. Reconstruction hoped to restore the Union, rebuild the South's economy and infrastructure, protect the rights of freed people, and heal the deep wounds left by the war. From the start, there was disagreement over how to restore the Union. President Abraham Lincoln was interested in reconciliation and healing. His 10% plan proposed that a Southern state could rejoin the Union once 10% of its voters pledged loyalty and accepted the end of slavery. Lincoln's hope was to bring the South back into the Union without humiliating it, hoping that working together to rebuild the country could overcome resentment. It is impossible to know for certain how Lincoln would have responded to the challenges that developed during Reconstruction. His assassination in April 1865 left Reconstruction in the hands of Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat from Tennessee who had remained loyal to the Union during the war. Johnson took an even softer approach, granting pardons to many former Confederate leaders and recognizing new state governments in the South with minimal demands. In many cases, these governments were dominated by the same people who had led the Confederacy just months earlier. Radical Republicans in Congress were alarmed. They feared Johnson's approach would allow the South to restore its pre-war power under a different name. Slavery might be gone, but white supremacy could survive intact. Radical Republicans wanted a reconstruction that would reshape Southern society, protect African Americans' civil rights, and prevent former Confederates from regaining power. This conflict between the president and Congress defined the early struggle over Reconstruction and led to one of the most intense political battles in American history. While political arguments continued in Washington, the physical and economic realities of the South demanded attention. The war had left entire cities in ruins, railroad lines twisted and unusable, and vast stretches of farmland abandoned or burned. The economic system, built on the exploitation of enslaved labor, collapsed. Plantation owners found themselves without workers, and freed people found themselves without land, tools, or money. In 1865, the federal government created the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency tasked with providing aid and relief to the former slaves. It distributed food, clothing, and medical care, helped establish schools, and assisted in negotiating labor contracts. For many freed people, the Bureau was their first introduction to the idea of the federal government as a protector, but results were often inconsistent. Despite these efforts, rebuilding the Southern economy was slow and difficult. Most freed people lacked the resources to buy land, and many white landowners refused to sell it. In the absence of land reform, systems like sharecropping and tenant farming emerged. These arrangements allowed African Americans and poor whites to work the land in exchange for a share of the crops, but they often came with high interest rates on supplies and manipulative accounting practices by landowners. In practice, sharecropping often trapped workers in cycles of debt and dependency that felt like slavery in all but name. Alongside economic recovery, Reconstruction carried an even more challenging goal: redefining the meaning of freedom and securing civil rights for African Americans. The abolition of slavery was formalized with the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865, but there was still a long way to go. Freedom, for the formerly enslaved, meant the right to control their own labor, own property, marry legally, send their children to school, and participate in the political life of the nation. Congress sought to protect these rights through legislation, while President Andrew Johnson continued to use his veto in opposition. Despite this, some important amendments to the Constitution were added. The 14th Amendment in 1868 granted due process of law, the equal protection of the laws, and birthright citizenship. The 15th Amendment in 1870 prohibited denying the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. For the first time, black men were elected to public office, serving as mayors, legislators, and even members of Congress. Leaders like Hiram Revels of Mississippi demonstrated that African Americans could participate fully in governance, challenging centuries of racist assumptions. But progress sparked intense backlash. Southern states passed black codes, laws designed to control the movement, labor, and behavior of African Americans, effectively limiting their newfound freedoms. At the same time, white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, using violence, intimidation, and murder to suppress black political participation. Protecting African Americans' rights often required federal troops, a reality that many white Southerners deeply resented and portrayed as an occupation. These tensions brought to the surface a deeper constitutional question. How far could the federal government go in shaping the laws and politics of individual states? The Civil War answered the question of whether states could secede, but it had not settled the issue of federal power versus states' rights, an issue we still debate today. Radical Republicans believe the federal government not only had the authority, but the moral duty to enforce equality across the nation. President Andrew Johnson vehemently opposed these measures and felt that political and economic life should remain under white control. He continued to veto several Reconstruction bills, only to be overridden by Congress. By the end of Johnson's presidency, he vetoed 29 bills. This battle resulted in Johnson's impeachment in 1868, making him the first American president to face such a trial. Though he was acquitted by a single vote in the Senate, his influence over Reconstruction was effectively broken. The Civil War had left deep scars not just on landscapes, but on hearts and minds. Communities had been torn apart, and more than 600,000 soldiers had died. Families were often split by political loyalties, and the mistrust and resentment between North and South continued throughout Reconstruction. For many Northerners, Reconstruction meant ensuring that the ideals for which they had fought were put into practice in the South. For many white Southerners, it meant regaining control and ending what they saw as Northern interference, even if that meant denying the rights of African Americans. By the mid-1870s, the political will to continue Reconstruction was fading. The Panic of 1873 triggered a severe economic depression, shifting national attention away from the South. People were ready to move on and did not want to think about or pay for Reconstruction anymore. Political corruption scandals during the Grant administration worsened the situation and eroded trust in the government. The contested presidential election of 1876 began the end of Reconstruction. Disputes over electoral votes in several Southern states led to the Compromise of 1877. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes would become president, but in exchange, federal troops would be withdrawn from the South. Once the troops left, Southern state governments quickly dismantled Reconstruction-era reforms. Jim Crow laws enforcing racial segregation and voter suppression spread rapidly, and African Americans in the South were stripped of political and civil rights. Much of the progress that had been made was undone. Reconstruction's legacy is one of both achievement and disappointment. The Union was restored and slavery was abolished, but the goal of true racial equality in the South remained unfulfilled. Still, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments provided a constitutional foundation for future struggles for equality. The story of Reconstruction is not simply a tale of failure. It was a bold, if incomplete, experiment in interracial democracy at a time when such a concept was revolutionary. It tested the nation's capacity to live up to its founding ideals and forced Americans to confront the meaning of freedom. The ambitions of Reconstruction and the unfinished work it left behind remain woven into American history. challenging each generation to ask how far the nation has come and how far it still has to go.